On April 28, 1945, at 3:47 p.m., Sergeant James Donnelly of the 2nd Infantry Division, United States Army, shot and killed a child. The boy was approximately 13 years old, wearing an oversized Wehrmacht uniform and carrying a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. He had emerged from the rubble of a destroyed building on Potsdamer Straße in Berlin, aimed the weapon at Donnelly's Sherman tank, and was in the process of firing when Donnelly, positioned in the tank commander's hatch with a .50 caliber machine gun, cut him down with a 3-second burst. The Panzerfaust round went wide, missing the tank by 2 meters and exploding harmlessly against a pile of rubble. The child fell backward, hit by at least 6 bullets. He was dead before he hit the ground. Donnelly had followed his training perfectly. He had identified a threat, engaged it immediately, and neutralized it with appropriate force. He had done exactly what a tank commander was supposed to do. Then he vomited over the side of his tank. Donnelly was 24 years old, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He had been in combat since D-Day, 11 months earlier. He had fought across France, survived the Battle of the Bulge, crossed the Rhine, and advanced through Germany. He had killed German soldiers in Normandy hedgerows and Belgian forests and German cities. He had seen his friends die. He had seen civilians caught in crossfire. He had seen the concentration camp at Dachau and understood, finally, what he was fighting against. But he had never killed a child before, not until April 28, 1945, when a 13-year-old boy tried to destroy his tank, and Donnelly's training and instincts took over before his mind could process what his eyes were seeing.
That night, in a commandeered basement that served as his unit's temporary headquarters, Donnelly sat against a wall and cried. His platoon leader, Lieutenant Morrison, sat down beside him but said nothing. What was there to say? That Donnelly had done the right thing? He had. That the boy would have killed Donnelly and his crew if given the chance? He would have. That this was war and terrible things happened in war? They did. But none of that changed the fact that Donnelly had killed a child, and he would see that child's face, mouth open in a battle cry, eyes wide with fanaticism and fear, for the rest of his life. Donnelly was not alone. In the final months of World War II, as Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan threw children into combat in desperate attempts to stave off defeat, Allied soldiers found themselves facing an impossible situation. Children who were trying to kill them, children who fought with genuine conviction, children who would not surrender, children who had to be killed or would kill first. This is the story that military histories often skip. This is the moral catastrophe that exists in the shadow of conventional narratives about the good war. This is what happened when the indoctrination of children collided with the reality of combat, and Allied soldiers were forced to become the very thing they had joined the military to oppose: killers of children. The year was 1944, and the Allied advance into Germany had revealed something unexpected and deeply disturbing. Nazi Germany was putting children into uniform and sending them to the front lines, not as auxiliaries or support personnel, but as combat soldiers expected to kill and be killed.
The Hitler Youth had been militarized throughout the war, but in 1944, the transformation accelerated dramatically. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, formed in 1943, was staffed almost entirely by 17- and 18-year-old Hitler Youth members, led by veteran officers and NCOs. But by late 1944, even younger children were being conscripted into regular Wehrmacht units and Volkssturm militia. Allied intelligence officers had documented this development, but documentation was different from confrontation. Reading a report that stated, "Germany is conscripting boys aged 14-16 was one thing. Actually encountering these child soldiers in combat was something else entirely. The first major contact between Allied forces and significant numbers of German child soldiers occurred during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The German offensive included Volkssturm units that contained boys as young as 14. American soldiers initially thought they were facing regular Wehrmacht troops in the confusion of the surprise attack. It was only after capturing prisoners and examining enemy dead that they realized how young some of their opponents were. Corporal Michael Chen of the 101st Airborne Division was part of the defense of Bastogne. His unit was dug in along a tree line when German forces attacked on December 20th, 1944. The attack was repulsed with heavy German casualties. When Chen's squad advanced to check the German dead and collect weapons, they found the body of a boy who Chen estimated was maybe 15 tops. The body was wearing a Volkssturm armband and carrying a Kar 98K rifle. The boy had been shot twice in the chest, killed instantly. His pockets contained a school identification card from a gymnasium in Stuttgart, a letter from his mother dated 3 weeks earlier, and a small photograph of what appeared to be a younger sister. His name was Franz Becker. He was 14 years old.
Chen would later write in his memoir, "I had been in combat for 6 months. I had seen plenty of dead soldiers. But Franz was the first one who looked like he should have been in my little brother's freshman class, not in a uniform trying to kill me. It fucked with my head in ways that fighting adult soldiers never did." The psychological impact on American soldiers of killing or fighting child soldiers was immediate and profound. Combat against adult enemy soldiers, while traumatic, fit within soldiers' psychological frameworks. These were men who had chosen to fight, who understood the risks, who were legitimate military targets. Their deaths, while tragic, made sense within the context of war. But children were different. American soldiers had been raised in a culture that placed enormous moral weight on protecting children. They had sisters and brothers and cousins back home who were the same age as the German children they were now fighting. The cognitive dissonance was severe. These were children who needed protection, but they were also enemy combatants who were trying to kill you. British forces encountered similar situations as they advanced into Germany from the northwest. Captain Geoffrey Willis of the British 11th Armored Division participated in the capture of several German towns in March 1945. His unit's standard procedure was to call for surrender, give civilians time to evacuate, and then engage any remaining resistance. In the town of Neustadt, Willis's company encountered resistance from a group of approximately 15 defenders holed up in a school building. The defenders had a machine gun and several rifles, and they fired on Willis's troops when they approached. Willis called for artillery support, which shelled the building for 10 minutes. When his troops entered the destroyed school, they found that 12 of the 15 defenders were boys aged 13 to 16. All were dead.
3 were Wehrmacht veterans who had been assigned to lead the Hitler Youth Defenders. They were dead too. Willis reported the incident to his battalion commander and was told, essentially, that this was war and these things happened. But Willis couldn't shake the image of the dead children scattered through the rubble of the school. In his diary that night, he wrote, "We have become the very monsters Nazi propaganda said we were. We shell children. We shoot children. Not because we are evil, but because they are shooting at us, and we have no choice. But knowing we have no choice doesn't make it easier." The worst psychological impact fell on soldiers who killed child combatants at close range. Sergeant Patrick O'Brien of the British 6th Airborne Division was involved in urban combat in a German town whose name he never recorded in his account. His squad was clearing buildings when they encountered a Hitler Youth member, approximately 15 years old, in a second-floor room. The boy had a rifle and fired at O'Brien's squad, missing. O'Brien returned fire with his Sten gun and killed the boy. O'Brien was a combat veteran, had participated in D-Day, had killed German soldiers in Normandy and Holland. But this was different. He approached the body to confirm the kill and found that the boy's face was destroyed by the 9mm rounds, but his hands were intact. Small hands, soft hands, hands that looked like they should be holding a football or a pencil, not a rifle. O'Brien searched the body for intelligence and found a diary. The entries were dated, and the most recent was from that morning. The boy had written, "Today I will prove myself worthy. Today I will defend the fatherland. I am not afraid."
O'Brien put the diary back and walked away. He told no one about what he had read. But 50 years later, in an oral history interview conducted in 1995, he would say, "I killed that boy because he was trying to kill me. I don't regret that. It was him or me. But I never forgot him either. I never forgot that he was just a kid who believed what he'd been taught, and he died for people who had lied to him. That wasn't his fault. But it didn't matter whose fault it was. He was still dead, and I was the one who killed him." The situation in the Pacific Theater was different in specifics, but similar in psychological impact. Japanese military culture had glorified death in battle and condemned surrender as shameful. This meant that Japanese soldiers, including very young ones, fought with a ferocity and disregard for their own lives that shocked American troops. The Battle of Okinawa from April to June 1945 represented the first major invasion of Japanese home territory. The Japanese defense included not just military personnel, but also civilian militia, school children pressed into service, and teenagers from the Iron and Blood Student Corps. The result was a nightmare of combat, where American soldiers couldn't always distinguish between armed combatants and terrified civilians, between adult soldiers and teenage volunteers, between someone attacking and someone fleeing. Private First Class Thomas Henderson of the 1st Marine Division participated in the assault on Okinawa. His battalion encountered resistance from a group of Japanese defenders in a village south of Naha. The defenders included regular Japanese army soldiers, local militia, and approximately 20 students from a local middle school, aged 14 to 16. The students had been given rifles and grenades and told to defend the village to the death.
Henderson's company attacked the village on May 14, 1945. The fighting lasted 6 hours. The Japanese defense was fierce and well coordinated. The middle school students fought alongside adult soldiers, showing the same willingness to die rather than surrender. When Henderson's squad finally secured one of the defensive positions, they found 8 dead defenders, 5 adult soldiers, and 3 boys in school uniforms who couldn't have been more than 15 years old. One of the boys was still barely alive, shot multiple times but conscious. Henderson called for a corpsman, a combat medic. The corpsman arrived, assessed the injuries, and shook his head. The boy was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do. Henderson didn't speak Japanese, and the boy didn't speak English, but they looked at each other for perhaps 30 seconds before the boy died. Henderson would later describe the look in the boy's eyes as confused, like he was wondering why this was happening, why he was dying in a ditch for reasons he didn't really understand. The corpsman who had tried to help the dying boy was named Daniel Ortiz. In a 1987 interview for a veteran's oral history project, Ortiz recalled, "I had treated hundreds of wounded men by that point. Japanese, American, didn't matter. A sucking chest wound is a sucking chest wound. But that kid got to me. He was wearing a school uniform under his military gear. A school uniform. He was supposed to be in class learning algebra, not bleeding out in a fucking ditch. And I kept thinking, his mother has no idea he's dead. She probably thinks he's safe in school. But he's dead because some bastard gave him a rifle and told him to fight."
The psychological toll on American servicemen was compounded by orders they received regarding Japanese civilians. After incidents where Japanese soldiers dressed as civilians to conduct ambush attacks, or where civilians suddenly revealed hidden grenades, American troops were given orders to treat all Japanese as potential combatants. This meant that the normal distinction between combatants and non-combatants broke down. Children could be enemy fighters, women could be suicide attackers. No one was safe to trust. Staff Sergeant Robert Martinez of the 96th Infantry Division described entering a cave system on Okinawa where Japanese civilians were hiding. His squad called for the civilians to surrender, using Japanese interpreters to communicate. Most of the civilians came out peacefully, but 3 teenage boys, estimated ages 14 to 17, suddenly rushed out of the cave toward Martinez's position. 2 were carrying grenades. The third was unarmed but charging directly at the American soldiers. Martinez's squad opened fire, killing all 3 boys instantly. After the firing stopped, Martinez approached the bodies. The unarmed boy was wearing a school uniform and carrying a small Japanese flag. The other 2 boys had grenades, but the grenades hadn't been armed. They still had the safety pins in place. It appeared that the boys had either panicked and charged before they could arm the grenades, or they had simply been too young and inexperienced to know how to properly use the weapons they'd been given. Martinez would struggle with that incident for the rest of his life. In his mind, there were 2 possibilities, both unbearable. Either the boys had genuinely intended to attack but were too incompetent to arm the grenades properly, in which case Martinez had killed children who were trying to kill him.
Or the boys had been panicking and running toward the Americans to surrender, and the grenades were never actually a threat, in which case Martinez had killed children who were trying to give up. Either way, 3 children were dead, and Martinez had participated in killing them. "I followed orders," Martinez said in a 1992 interview. "We had been told to assume hostile intent. We had been told that Japanese civilians couldn't be trusted. We had been told that even children could be weapons. And all of that was true. It had all happened. But those 3 boys, I don't know what they intended. I'll never know. And that's what eats at me. I killed them without knowing whether they were attacking or surrendering, and I had maybe 2 seconds to make that decision. 2 seconds to decide whether 3 teenage boys lived or died.
How the fuck is anyone supposed to make that call? The situation reached its psychological nadir in the final weeks of the war in Europe, as Allied forces entered Berlin and other German cities where child soldiers were deployed in large numbers. By April 1945, Nazi Germany had mobilized thousands of boys aged 12 to 16 for the defense of Berlin. These children were given minimal training, inadequate weapons, and orders to fight to the death. Soviet forces bore the brunt of encountering these child soldiers in Berlin. The Red Army's approach was less restrained than American or British forces. Soviet troops had witnessed the devastation of their homeland, had seen the atrocities committed by German forces in the Soviet Union, and had been encouraged by Soviet propaganda to show no mercy. When Soviet soldiers encountered child soldiers, they often killed them as readily as they killed adult soldiers.
But even hardened Soviet veterans found the experience disturbing. Lieutenant Anatoly Kozlov of the 3rd Shock Army wrote in a letter home dated May 2, 1945, "We fought Hitler Youth today. Children. Some of them couldn't be more than 13 or 14 years old. They fought like demons, fanatics who charged our tanks with Panzerfausts, who fired from rubble until we killed them. We gave them chances to surrender. Some did. Most didn't. We killed perhaps 40 of them today. Tomorrow we will kill more. And the day after that, more still. How many German children will I kill before this war ends?" American forces also encounter child soldiers in Berlin, though in smaller numbers than Soviet troops, since American forces approached from the west, while Soviets attacked from the east. Sergeant Donnelly, whose story opened this account, was typical of American soldiers' experiences. They followed their training, engaged threats as they appeared, and only afterward, when they examined the bodies or took prisoners, realized they had been fighting children. The psychological impact was delayed for many soldiers. During combat, adrenaline and training took over. Soldiers reacted to threats without thinking deeply about them. It was only later, hours, days, or years later, that the full weight of what they had done settled in. Captain Richard Thompson of the 82nd Airborne Division participated in combat in several German towns in April 1945. His company encountered Hitler Youth resistance repeatedly. In a 1997 interview, Thompson described the delayed psychological impact. "During the fighting, you don't think. You see a figure with a weapon, you engage. That's what you're trained to do. That's what keeps you alive. But then the fighting stops, and you're sitting there drinking coffee or eating sea rations, and your mind starts working again. And you remember that the figure with a weapon was a kid, maybe 14 years old, wearing a uniform 3 sizes too big.
And you killed him. You had to kill him. He was shooting at you, but you still killed him. And then you start wondering about that kid, who he was, what his name was, whether his mother knows he's dead, whether he was scared, whether he understood what he was dying for. And those thoughts don't go away. They sit there in your head, and they come back at unexpected times. I'd be watching my own kids play, and suddenly I'd remember some German kid I killed in April 1945, and I'd have to leave the room. British forces had similar experiences in their sector. The British Second Army, advancing from the northwest, encountered Hitler Youth resistance in several towns. Captain Willis, mentioned earlier, participated in over a dozen engagements with child soldiers between March and May 1945. In his memoir, published in 1982, he reflected, "We became desensitized, which is perhaps the most disturbing thing. The first time we killed children, it was deeply traumatic. By the 10th time, it was just another engagement. We stopped thinking of them as children and started thinking of them as small soldiers. This was psychologically necessary. We couldn't function in combat if we were paralyzed by moral horror every time we encountered a Hitler Youth unit. But it also meant we became people who could kill children without immediate emotional reaction. That transformation, that necessity, is its own kind of moral injury." The Pacific Theater presented even more extreme versions of these psychological dilemmas. As the Allies advanced closer to Japan proper, Japanese defense became more fanatical and included more extensive use of very young combatants. The Battle of Okinawa in spring 1945 was the preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would have entailed.
Japanese military planners explicitly incorporated civilian casualties, including children, into their defensive strategy. The plan called for every Japanese citizen capable of holding a weapon to resist the invasion. This meant women, elderly, and children would be armed with whatever was available: rifles, grenades, bamboo spears, improvised explosives, and would be expected to kill invading soldiers or die trying. American intelligence was aware of these plans through intercepted communications and interrogations of prisoners. American soldiers approaching Okinawa were briefed that they might face civilian resistance, including children. This briefing was supposed to prepare them psychologically, but there is no preparation adequate for being attacked by children. Corporal James Peterson of the 6th Marine Division described an incident in a village on northern Okinawa in May 1945. His squad was conducting a sweep of buildings when they encountered an elderly woman and 3 children in a house. Peterson's interpreter called for them to come out peacefully. The elderly woman emerged, followed by 2 children aged approximately 8 and 10. The children were holding each other's hands and crying. They appeared terrified but harmless. As Peterson's squad was securing the children, a 3rd child, a boy estimated at age 12, suddenly emerged from the house holding a grenade. The boy was crying, screaming something in Japanese that the interpreter later translated as, "For the Emperor." The boy pulled the pin on the grenade and charged toward Peterson's squad. Marine Private Luis Gonzalez, age 19, shot the boy before he could reach them. The grenade detonated when the boy fell, killing no one but wounding 2 Marines with shrapnel. The 8 and 10-year-old children who had surrendered watched their brother die.
Peterson's squad detained the elderly woman and the 2 surviving children, who were eventually transferred to a civilian internment camp. Peterson filed a report on the incident. In that report, which is preserved in the National Archives, Peterson wrote, "Private Gonzalez acted appropriately and potentially saved multiple lives by engaging the hostile immediately. However, all personnel involved are experiencing significant psychological distress at having been forced to kill a child, regardless of the tactical necessity." Peterson himself would later describe the incident in more emotional terms during a 1989 oral history interview. Luis was 19 years old. The kid he shot was maybe 12. "Luis saved our lives. That grenade would have killed or wounded several of us if it had detonated in the middle of our squad. Luis did exactly what he was supposed to do. But Luis was never the same after that. He had nightmares. He drank. He couldn't hold a job. Last I heard, he died by suicide in 1973, 28 years after the war ended. You can draw your own conclusions about what killing that kid did to him." The most psychologically damaging incidents occurred when American soldiers encountered Japanese children who had been prepared for suicide attacks. On Okinawa, Japanese forces had organized groups of school children into grenade assault teams. The children would be given grenades and told to run at American positions and detonate the grenades as close to American soldiers as possible. This was explicitly a suicide mission. The children were not expected to survive.
Lieutenant Colonel Harold Detweiler of the 7th Infantry Division encountered such an attack on May 18, 1945. His unit was advancing along a road when approximately 15 Japanese schoolchildren, ages 10 to 14, rushed out of a building toward his troops. The children were carrying grenades and screaming battle cries. Detweiler's troops opened fire, killing all 15 children before any of them could get close enough to detonate their grenades. Detweiler reported the incident up the chain of command and requested counseling resources for his men. In his official report, he wrote, "The psychological impact on my troops of mass killing children, regardless of tactical necessity, is severe. Several men are showing signs of acute stress reaction. I am not qualified to provide the level of psychological support they require. Request immediate assignment of psychological personnel to address this issue." The request was denied. There were no psychological personnel available. The men were told to deal with it. Some did, some didn't. Detweiler would later estimate that approximately 30% of the soldiers in his unit who participated in that engagement showed signs of long-term psychological trauma directly attributable to that specific incident. The moral and psychological weight fell heaviest on soldiers who had to kill child soldiers at very close range, or in situations where the threat was ambiguous. These incidents didn't allow the psychological distance of long-range combat. The soldiers could see the children's faces, could see how young they were, could sometimes see their fear mixed with fanaticism.
Private First Class Vincent D'Angelo of the 1st Infantry Division was involved in urban combat in a German town in April 1945. His squad was clearing a building when they encountered a Hitler Youth member in a second-floor apartment. The boy was approximately 14 years old, wearing a uniform and holding a rifle.
When D'Angelo's squad entered the room, the boy raised the rifle. D'Angelo, who was the first one through the door, shot the boy 3 times in the chest with his M1 Garand rifle. D'Angelo approached the body to verify the kill and search for intelligence. The boy was definitely dead, but he had fallen backward and his rifle had fallen beside him. When D'Angelo looked closely at the rifle, he realized it wasn't loaded. The boy had been holding an unloaded rifle. Whether he knew it was unloaded, whether he was trying to bluff, whether he was simply going through the motions of combat because that's what he'd been trained to do, D'Angelo never knew. In a 2001 interview conducted shortly before his death, D'Angelo reflected on that moment. "I had maybe half a second to make that decision. I saw a figure in uniform holding a rifle in a combat zone. I did what I was trained to do. I fired. But that kid's rifle wasn't even loaded. So did I kill a real threat? Or did I kill a terrified child who was holding an empty rifle because he didn't know what else to do? I've had 60 years to think about that question, and I still don't have an answer." British soldiers faced similar moral ambiguities. Sergeant William Ashford of the British 3rd Infantry Division encountered a group of Hitler Youth fighters during the liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in April 1945. The Hitler Youth unit was defending a road leading to the camp. They were approximately 20 boys, ages 14 to 17, with rifles and 1 machine gun. Ashford's company attacked the position. The Hitler Youth fought fiercely for about 20 minutes before breaking and running. Ashford's troops pursued and captured 3 of the boys alive. The rest were killed in the fighting or escaped. When Ashford interrogated the prisoners, he learned that they had been stationed there to prevent Allied forces from reaching the camp. They had been told that the camp was a military installation that had to be defended at all costs. The boys had no idea what was actually in the camp. They didn't know about the thousands of dead and dying prisoners. They didn't know about the atrocities. They just knew they had orders to defend a position, and they had followed those orders to the best of their ability. Some of their friends had died following those orders. Ashford was faced with a terrible realization. These children had died defending a concentration camp, but they had no idea that's what they were doing. They had been used as expendable shields, thrown into combat without even the dignity of understanding what they were fighting for. In his memoir, Ashford wrote, "We killed those boys because they were shooting at us. We had no choice. But after we saw what was in the camp, after we understood what they had been defending without knowing it, I felt a different kind of anger. Not at the boys. They were victims, used and discarded by people who should have protected them, but at the system that had done this to them, that had taken children and turned them into soldiers and sent them to die defending a death camp they knew nothing about. That's evil on a level I still struggle to comprehend."
Soviet forces, particularly as they advanced through Poland and into Germany, encountered situations where German child soldiers were defending locations where atrocities had been committed. Soviet soldiers who had liberated concentration camps or discovered mass graves sometimes encountered Hitler Youth units defending these areas. The psychological impact was complex. Rage at what had been discovered, mixed with awareness that the children defending these sites probably had no knowledge of what was there. Major Ivan Ketrov of the Soviet First Belarusian Front participated in the liberation of several camps in Poland and Germany. In one incident in April 1945, his unit liberated a forced labor camp and then encountered a Hitler Youth unit nearby. The unit consisted of approximately 30 boys, ages 13 to 16. In the subsequent firefight, 24 of the boys were killed. 6 surrendered. Petrov interrogated the prisoners himself. He asked them if they knew what the camp was. They said it was a work camp for enemies of the Reich. He asked if they knew what happened to the workers. They said they assumed the workers were building military installations. Petrov took the 6 prisoners to the camp and showed them the bodies, showed them the gas chambers, showed them the evidence of systematic murder. The boys broke down. Some vomited. One passed out. Petrov wrote in his journal that night, "I wanted them to know. I wanted them to see what they had been defending. But watching their faces as they realized what their country had done, what they had been part of without knowing, there was no satisfaction in it. They were children. They had been lied to, and now they will carry this knowledge for the rest of their lives. I showed them the truth, but the truth has destroyed them. Was that justice? I don't know anymore."
The long-term psychological impact on Allied soldiers who killed or fought child soldiers was severe and lasting. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though it wouldn't be formally recognized and named until 1980, was common among these veterans. The specific trauma of killing children created a particular form of psychological injury that was distinct from the general trauma of combat. Dr. Sarah Morrison, a psychologist who worked with World War II veterans in the 1970s and 1980s, noted in a 1986 research paper, veterans who killed child combatants exhibit psychological patterns distinct from other combat veterans. They report higher rates of nightmares specifically featuring the children they killed. They report more difficulty with parenting their own children, often becoming either overprotective or emotionally distant. They report more survivor's guilt, particularly centering on the question of why they survived when children died. And they report more difficulty integrating their combat experience into their life narrative, because the moral framework that allows veterans to accept killing adult enemy soldiers breaks down when applied to children. Many veterans never spoke about their experiences killing child soldiers. The shame and guilt were too intense. The fear of being judged by family, by friends, by society was too great. James Donnelly, the sergeant who opened this account, never told his wife about killing the child with the Panzerfaust. She learned about it only after his death in 1998, when she read through his war diary that he had kept hidden for 53 years. Some veterans spoke about it only late in life, often in oral history interviews conducted decades after the war. The passage of time didn't heal the psychological wounds, but it sometimes gave veterans enough distance to articulate what they had experienced without being overwhelmed by emotion.
Thomas Henderson, the Marine who watched a 15-year-old Japanese boy die in Okinawa, gave an oral history interview in 1995 when he was 71 years old. At one point in the interview, he broke down crying while describing the boy's death. The interview had to be paused for 20 minutes. When it resumed, Henderson said, "I'm sorry. I thought I was past this. It's been 50 years. But I guess you never really get past killing a child, even when you didn't have a choice." Some veterans channeled their trauma into activism. Robert Martinez, whose story was told earlier, became an anti-war activist after the war. He participated in protests against the Vietnam War, wrote letters to newspapers condemning the use of child soldiers by any military force, and spent years working with a veterans organization that provided psychological support to combat veterans. He frequently spoke publicly about his experience killing the 3 Japanese boys on Okinawa, using his story to illustrate the moral costs of war. Other veterans internalized their trauma and suffered in silence. Luis Gonzalez, who shot the 12-year-old Japanese boy with the grenade, never spoke publicly about the incident. His family knew he had severe PTSD, but didn't know the specific source until after his suicide in 1973. He left a note that mentioned the incident briefly. "I saved my squad but killed a kid. I did the right thing, but it doesn't matter. I can still see his face. I'll always see his face." The British government eventually recognized that veterans who had fought against child soldiers needed specialized psychological support. In 1983, the Ministry of Defense commissioned a study on the long-term psychological effects of combat against child soldiers in World War II. The study found that veterans who had killed child combatants had significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and suicide compared to other combat veterans.
Based on these findings, specialized counseling programs were created, though by 1983, many of the veterans were already elderly, and the programs came too late for many who had already died. The moral questions raised by Allied soldiers' combat against child soldiers remained difficult and contentious. On one hand, the soldiers followed the laws of war. Child soldiers, regardless of age, are legal combatants if they are actively participating in hostilities. Soldiers have a legal right to defend themselves against anyone who is trying to kill them, regardless of the attacker's age. Every Allied soldier who killed a child combatant in self-defense or in defense of their unit acted legally under international law as it existed at the time. But legality is not the same as morality. The soldiers knew this, even as they pulled the trigger, even as they followed their training perfectly, even as they did what was legally and tactically correct. They knew they were crossing a moral boundary that would haunt them forever. The real moral responsibility lies with the regimes that put children into combat. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan bear full responsibility for the moral catastrophe of child soldiers fighting Allied forces. They created the indoctrination systems that convinced children to fight. They issued the orders that sent children to the front lines. They established the military doctrines that treated children as expendable military assets.
The Allied soldiers who killed these children were not perpetrators. They were secondary victims of decisions made by Nazi and Japanese leadership. But this moral clarity doesn't eliminate the psychological burden. The veterans understood intellectually that they weren't at fault, that they had no choice, that the responsibility lay with the enemy regimes. But that intellectual understanding didn't stop the nightmares, didn't erase the memories, didn't make it easier to look at their own children without remembering the children they had killed. Some philosophers and ethicists have argued that Allied soldiers had a moral obligation to take greater risks to avoid killing child soldiers, even if those risks could have led to Allied casualties. This argument suggests that soldiers should have attempted to disarm or capture child combatants rather than shooting them, even when such attempts would have been tactically dangerous. Most veterans reject this argument vehemently. Captain Thompson, in his 1997 interview, responded to this suggestion with anger. That's easy to say from a university office 70 years after the fact, but in the moment, when you have half a second to decide, when a figure with a weapon is pointing that weapon at you or your friends, you don't have time for philosophical reflection. You react. You do what your training tells you to do. And if some philosopher wants to say I should have risked my life or my squad's lives to try to capture a fanatic teenager who was trying to kill us, then fuck that philosopher. He wasn't there. He doesn't get to judge. This tension between academic ethical analysis and combat reality is unresolvable. Both perspectives have validity. It is possible to acknowledge that Allied soldiers did what they had to do under impossible circumstances, while also recognizing that killing children is a moral tragedy, even when legally justified and tactically necessary.
The comparative scale of Allied forces' combat against child soldiers varied significantly by theater and by nationality. American forces encountered child soldiers most heavily in the final months of the European War, March-May 1945, and during the Okinawa Campaign, April-June 1945. British forces encountered child soldiers primarily in northwest Germany in April and May 1945. Soviet forces encountered the largest numbers of German child soldiers during the assault on Berlin and other German cities in April and May 1945. The exact numbers of child soldiers killed by Allied forces will never be known. Record-keeping did not typically note the age of enemy combatants. What exists is scattered mentions in after-action reports, occasional notes in unit histories, and the personal accounts of veterans who remembered these encounters specifically because they were psychologically distinctive. Conservative estimates suggest that several thousand German child soldiers aged 16 and under were killed by Allied forces, primarily Soviet forces in the Battle of Berlin. Hundreds of Japanese child combatants were killed in Okinawa and in smaller numbers in other battles. These numbers are necessarily imprecise, but they represent a minimum based on available documentation. The numbers matter less than the pattern. Every account, every unit history, every veteran interview from the final months of the war mentions encounters with child soldiers. This was not a rare occurrence. This was a systemic feature of combat in 1945. Allied soldiers didn't occasionally encounter child soldiers. They encountered them repeatedly, sometimes daily, as Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan threw their children into combat in desperate attempts to delay defeat.
The psychological toll was cumulative. Killing one child soldier was traumatic. Killing multiple child soldiers, seeing child soldiers killed by your comrades repeatedly, encountering child soldiers in engagement after engagement, that produced psychological damage that compounded over time. Veterans who had multiple encounters with child soldiers showed higher rates of severe PTSD than those who had only one such encounter. The Allied High Command was aware of the psychological impact on troops, but had limited ability to address it. Field commanders occasionally mentioned the issue in reports to higher headquarters. Some officers requested psychological support for troops who had been involved in heavy combat against child soldiers. But the military mental health resources in 1945 were rudimentary by modern standards, and the concept of combat stress counseling barely existed. The standard approach was denial and suppression. Soldiers were told not to dwell on it, to focus on the mission, to remember that they were fighting an evil regime, and these children were tools of that regime. This approach prevented immediate psychological breakdowns that could have compromised unit cohesion, but it stored up psychological damage for later. Many veterans functioned adequately during the war and then experienced severe PTSD symptoms years or decades later when the suppressed trauma resurfaced. The legacy of Allied combat against child soldiers extends beyond the individual veterans to broader questions about modern warfare and military ethics.
The Geneva Conventions were revised after World War II, and the 1977 additional protocols specifically addressed the participation of children in armed conflict. Article 77 of Additional Protocol 1 states, "The parties to the conflict shall take all feasible measures in order that children who have not attained the age of 15 years do not take a direct part in hostility."
This language reflects the lesson of World War II. Using children as combatants is morally wrong and militarily counterproductive. It's wrong because it violates children's rights to protection and development. It's counterproductive because it creates massive psychological casualties among both the child soldiers and the adult soldiers forced to fight them. But all feasible measures is deliberately vague. What happens when a military force encounters child soldiers despite these measures? The Geneva Conventions are clear. Age doesn't eliminate the right to self-defense. If a child is actively participating in hostilities and poses a threat, enemy forces may engage that threat. The law recognizes the terrible reality that combat doesn't pause for moral philosophy. Modern militaries train soldiers on how to handle encounters with child soldiers. The training emphasizes attempting to disarm or detain child combatants when tactically feasible, but it also acknowledges that lethal force may be necessary if the child poses an immediate threat. This training is an attempt to balance humanitarian concerns with military necessity, the same balance that World War II veterans had to strike in the moment without any training to prepare them. Child soldiers remain a problem in modern conflicts. Various armed groups around the world continue to recruit and use children as combatants. International law prohibits this practice, and recruiting child soldiers is classified as a war crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But legal prohibitions don't eliminate the practice, which means that modern soldiers continue to face the same moral dilemmas that haunted World War II veterans.
The difference is that modern soldiers receive some preparation for these encounters, some acknowledgement that this situation may occur and is psychologically dangerous, some post-combat psychological support if they are forced to kill child combatants. These measures don't eliminate the trauma, but they provide frameworks for processing it that didn't exist in 1945. The World War II veterans who fought against child soldiers were pioneers in confronting a moral horror that would recur in later conflicts. Their experiences, their trauma, their attempts to articulate what they had been through, these laid the groundwork for modern understanding of this particular form of combat stress. When Luis Gonzalez shot that Japanese boy with the grenade in Okinawa, when James Donnelly killed the Hitler Youth with the Panzerfaust in Berlin, when Robert Martinez watched 3 teenage boys die in a cave on Okinawa, they were experiencing something that no military training had prepared them for, and that no psychological framework existed to process. Their suffering was not in vain if we learn from it. The lesson is not that soldiers who kill child combatants are victims, though they are secondary victims of the regimes that put children into combat. The lesson is not that killing children is acceptable when legally justified, though it may be legally justified. The lesson is that using child soldiers is a moral catastrophe that creates trauma for everyone involved and should never happen. In the final accounting, the story of Allied soldiers fighting child soldiers in World War II is a story about moral injury on a massive scale. Thousands of young men, American, British, Canadian, Soviet, Australian, and others, were forced by circumstances beyond their control to kill children. They did so legally. They did so in self-defense. They did so to protect their comrades. They did so because the alternative was to die or to watch their friends die.
And they carried the psychological burden of those killings for the rest of their lives. James Donnelly died in 1998 at age 77. His obituary made no mention of the war, per his request. But his war diary, which his widow donated to the World War II Museum after his death, contains an entry from April 28, 1945, written late that night after he had killed the child with the Panzerfaust. Killed a kid today. Maybe 13, maybe 14. He tried to kill me first. I did what I had to do. But I keep seeing his face. I keep thinking about his mother. Somewhere in this destroyed city is a woman who doesn't know her son is dead. Tomorrow or the next day, she'll find out. She'll learn that an American soldier killed her child, and she'll be right to hate me for it, even though I didn't have a choice, even though he was trying to kill me, even though this whole fucking situation is Hitler's fault, not mine. She'll still be right to hate me, because I killed her child, and I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that's true.
The only true perpetrators were the architects of the systems that put children into combat: Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, Tojo, and the hundreds of officers and officials who implemented policies that sacrificed children for lost causes. They bear full moral responsibility for every child soldier killed by Allied forces, because they created the conditions that made those deaths inevitable. If you found this history compelling and disturbing, please share it. These stories resist simple narratives about the good war and remind us that even just wars involve moral catastrophes. Understanding these complexities is essential for anyone who wants to honestly confront what war actually means. Subscribe to support long-form historical content that examines the psychological realities of combat, not just the strategic outcomes. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your own family's connection to these events. Our community values difficult truths over comfortable myths. Thank you for engaging with this painful history. Thank you for recognizing that the soldiers who killed child combatants in World War II deserve understanding rather than judgment. Thank you for remembering that behind every statistic of war are human beings whose lives were irrevocably changed by circumstances they didn't create and couldn't control. The children who died deserved better than what their regimes gave them. The soldiers who killed them deserved better than the impossible choices they were forced to make. Both statements are true. Both tragedies are real. And remembering both is essential if we want to understand the full human cost of war.